I am thrilled to be here this evening having this really important conversation. So, in our time together today, I hope to define some agricultural techniques, right? So, farming practices. We hear a lot of terms like natural, conventional, organic, regenerative. What do those terms mean? And I will give us some working definitions so that we can actually figure out how to interact with those foods, when we can choose them, when it's really important. I also want to explain the potential health impacts of exposure to pesticides and pathogens for survivors, because this is important as you navigate this part of your journey. I also want to examine food-related pesticide exposures. And then finally, we'll close out with how do we actually put this into action, right? What are some tips so that we can actually reduce our pesticide exposure from foods, because we know that they're around us, but what are the things that we can do? And then we'll have a really robust question and answer. So I wanted to just give you all a little background on who I am. I'm Maya Feller, and I'm a registered dietitian. I've got a Brooklyn-based practice where we work with people across the life cycle for a variety of conditions. I have this community agreement here because when we get to the question and answer part, this is a hot topic. And sometimes it gets murky when we're having these conversations. So I want us to be able to ask questions with respect. If we see things in the chat that we disagree with, as they say, just let it be. But I want us to agree that we're going to come here with an open heart, open mind, and that we're going to really respect other people's thoughts, and that will hopefully come away with something new that we have learned. So let's get started here with organic farming. This is a term that many of us are quite familiar with. Interestingly, though, that in 2019, it only made up about 1% of total farming in the United States. That means that only about 1% was actually dedicated to certified organic production, even though organic sales were about 3% of like the total farming receipts. So that really kind of reflects this desire for increased consumer demand. And as of 2021, really exciting, about almost 5 million acres of farming land were dedicated to organic farming. Now, when we're thinking about, why is something organic, we know that there's a certification that is required by the USDA. And this certification focuses on a variety of areas, including soil quality, right? So how do we treat the soil? There's the use of organic fertilizer, compost, cow dung, manure, organic matter goes back into the soil. What's happening with animals if we're talking about animal husbandry in organic farming practices? Well, if they're talking about the animals, they have to have access to outdoor areas. They have to be able to roam freely, shade. They need shade. They also have to have shelter, these animals. The animals also need to have access to fresh drinking water and direct sunlight. In addition, there's no growth hormones that should be used, and the limited use of antibiotics. And then when we're thinking about pest and weed control, we're not using the farmers are not using synthetic fertilizers and pesticides when we're thinking about organic farming and pesticides and weed control. So those farmers use biological and cultural pest control methods. First line of defense in organic farming. When pesticides are in fact necessary, they have to be natural or minimally processed substances. And that is also approved by organic certification like the USDA. And if you've traveled overseas, you may have seen something like a BO certification that's from the European Union. So what are some of these organic approved pesticides? So there's botanical extracts, neem oil, microbial pesticides, so like bacteria would be used. I've even seen on some of my farm visits other bugs and pests used in organic farming, specifically in strawberry farming. It's very interesting. They will set out a bunch of bugs that just eat the undesirable bugs. We might see mineral-based pesticides or natural oils in soaps. So that's how we're thinking about pest and weed control. In addition, when we're looking at the use of additives, there should not be any synthetic chemicals or genetically modified organisms. And then with packaged goods, we don't see any artificial preservatives, colors, or flavors. Now, I do want to say something again and just quickly jump back to the animal husbandry. When we're thinking about food for those animals, in addition to being able to graze on the pasture, they have to be fed 100% organic feed. And then, as I said, they're not administered growth hormones or antibiotics. Now, if we're thinking about those packaged goods, which is our last bullet, that food also has to meet organic standards. So if the packaged good says that it is organic, it's got to meet those organic standards. Next is a term that you may have seen, local or regional food. And local and regional food is food that is sold within 400 miles of its origin, right? This is that farm to table idea. And really what this does is that it reduces the distance from where your food is grown to when you actually have it in your hand. Now, there are two primary types of local food. We have what is known as direct to consumer, right? So that's like direct to either you or me. And in this case, sometimes there's community supported agriculture, which is a CSA. Perhaps a group of people get together and they have a contract with the farmer. And many of you may actually be CSA members. And you have a contract with the farmer and you purchase a share. So this farmer knows, and let's just call it the Maya Feller CSA, or let's call it the Brooklyn, New York CSA. The farmer knows that the Brooklyn, New York CSA has 100 members and 100 people for whatever the growing season is that's agreed upon between us, Brooklyn, New York CSA, and the farmer. We're each going to receive a package. And that package could have produce that is locally grown. That package could also have animal proteins that are locally grown. The package could have dairy products that are locally sourced and made. And so anything that is local to that area within 400 miles could be in that CSA package. And so that is direct to us. There's also direct to smaller outfits where we can go there and pick it up ourselves. Perhaps there's also direct to retail or food service. And this is something that we're very, very accustomed to. So what are some of the reasons that we choose to purchase locally grown food? Well, there's so many benefits. I have to say here, when we're thinking about the pesticide load, it doesn't necessarily mean that because it's local, it's pesticide free. There are, ways and that if your food is traveling a shorter distance, we don't have to use as many chemical treatments, wax coatings, and preservatives, simply because those things actually extend the shelf life during a long transport. But if we're eating, us, the consumers, are eating local food, we don't have to rely, as I said, on those coatings and preservatives and treatments. So you get to know your farmer, which is fantastic. You actually can say to your farmer, what are your farming practices? What are you actually organic? Or are you using a low pesticide method, even if you're not an organic farm? And your farmer can actually respond to you in real time right there. You also can have the positive relationship with the producers and the impact on the environment, as well as animal welfare. So the carbon footprint is lower because it's traveling not nearly as far. And you can also talk to your farmers about what's going on right there on the farm. One of my favorite things is the opportunity to purchase unique items. There may be things that are incredibly small batch that you can get directly from a farmer if you're shopping with a CSA or if you're shopping in a farmer's market. Also, you have access to seasonal and fresher products. Interestingly enough, when we eat seasonal, there is some compelling research that says the shorter distance between the farm and that table, the higher the nutrients in the food. And when we're eating seasonal food, we're eating things that are completely fresh. Sometimes they were picked just the day before and it's on our table and in our bodies, which is quite exciting from my perspective. Next, we have regenerative farming. Now, this may be something that is new to you because we're just starting to see this word pop up on store shelves. One of the pointers that we see with regenerative farming and food is that it tends to actually be more expensive than organic farming and more expensive than local food that we purchase. So, one of the tenets of regenerative farming is the restoration of degraded soil using ecological principles. So it's interesting. I went to the World Economic Forum and I was looking at some of the research. The question of like, why would we want to have farmers engage in regenerative farming from a health perspective, from a nutrient density perspective, from a climate perspective? And this is what I found. So the World Economic Forum has 5 points for why regenerative farming is beneficial. They say that number one, climate, right? Regenerative farming helps to mitigate emissions through carbon sequestration and improved crop resilience for climate shocks. So it's interesting, this idea of how and what we plant as farmers, or how and what our farmers plant, rotating crops, and then actually sequestering carbon through the resilience of the crops. Number two from the World Economic Forum is soil health. So you'll see that here as my number one bullet. The health of the soil is directly related to the nutrient density of whatever that food or crop is. So when we have healthy soils, it actually improves the fertility through increased biomass production. So basically what that means is that the soil itself is quite nutrient dense. The same way that we pick up nutrients from the foods that we eat, our plants and the animals that we eat pick up nutrients from the soil. So when we're thinking about soil health, we're also thinking about biomass production, and we're also thinking about biodiversity of what's in the soil. And that also helps to prevent the breakdown of soil. So remember, regenerative farming is actually restoring that degraded soil using these eco-forward ecological principles. Number 3 is resource use efficiency. And I find this to be very, very interesting because oftentimes when we're thinking about using resources, things like water, right? Or fresh water, that might not be top of mind when we're thinking about the food that's coming to us as consumers. However, when our farmers think about using resources more efficiently, then that means that it has a positive impact on soil, which has a positive impact on us as humans, which also has a positive impact on climate. And then number 4, they list is biodiversity. And this is really an important concept because we're talking about the rotation of crops, but we're also talking about reducing pesticide usage on farms. And in some cases, we actually see more higher crop yields in natural habitats rather than having them being cleared for agriculture. So with biodiversity, I want you to think of like a Disney Pixar movie. And I use this example quite a bit. Usually in those movies, there are these huge green fields that have a bunch of technicolor flowers. And sometimes the carpeted fields move in those movies, right? And there's tons of different beautiful colors and it looks lush and dense. In theory, that's what we want our agricultural land to look like, rather than just monocropping and having one crop and another crop. When it has biodiversity, the soil is much more resilient to both drought and rain. And then it also means that it traps the nutrients in a very different way. And number 5 from the World Economic Forum is prosperity. Regenerative agriculture, they say, improves long-term farmer livelihood through reduced costs. Why do I bring this up? It's so important because we get our food from farms. And without farmers, we actually don't have access to food, and we need food to live. So what we really want is improved crop yield. We want greater resilience, and we also want to see different ways that farmers can interact with soil, water, plants, and animals, because in the long run, it's actually great for us. It also allows us to focus on land stewardship and longevity, right? So what's happening now is great, but what's also going to happen 50 years down the line? Hopefully, as a clinician, I hope that regenerative farming will be more in the forefront and that this will be something that we have access to. There is a Regenerative Organic Alliance, and that alliance uses an organic certification plus incorporating soil health and a stable or balanced ecosystem. So from my perspective, I find this to actually be a really positive step in the right direction when we're thinking about what are the certifications that we want to see on our food. I do always have to bring up this question around finances. Remember, I started out by saying regenerative farming, we don't see a lot of labels out there saying that this was regeneratively farmed. If we already know that organic makes up about 1% of all farmland, and even though there's increased consumer demand, it's still quite expensive in comparison to conventional farming. Then we know that local foods, you have to be in a place where you either have access to a CSA or you have access to a farmer's market. And in some cases, it can be more expensive than conventional farming. So now to my point about regenerative farming is that it is quite expensive. Every time I've seen the label in grocery stores, it is kind of the pinnacle of how we want food to be grown. However, it's quite expensive. So we would have to see an increased consumer demand and also, I would say, kind of rules and regulations that encourage farmers to engage in regenerative farming because it's not only good for the planet and good for the farmer, but it's also good for us ourselves. Next is natural farming. So natural farming was pioneered in Japan, and then it was later popularized in India. And it's based on this idea of zero chemical inputs and minimal human intervention. It's not likely that we have seen anything on our shelves that has gone through a natural farming method. The one and only time that I've actually seen natural farming like in the flesh is when I took a trip to Tobago in the Caribbean and I was in the rainforest. And I was taking a tour in the rainforest, which was incredibly lush. And when we talk about biodiversity, you have bamboo next to palm trees, next to mango trees, next to coconut, next to pineapple. And that's because the soil is incredibly healthy. And the person that was giving us the tour showed us their compost. And out of the compost was growing 3 different plants. I use that example to tell you about natural farming because in natural farming, the idea is that you avoid mechanical and chemical inputs. It's not likely that we are able to have, in the US, our soil is not nearly as fertile as the rainforest. We also don't have that level of biodiversity in terms of where we're planting crops. But it's interesting because this is the idea that when you don't use a synthetic pesticide or herbicide and there's natural control, that actually organic matter breaks down on its own, either microbes, earthworms, or whatever. It adds nutrition to the soil. And then it's this really low cost farming method that allows things to sprout. It's really not realistic for urban settings. However, it is a noble thought. I would love to know if anyone has ever came across natural farming or been able to purchase something that was naturally farmed in the US. And you can tell me in the question and answer time. And if so, then we're all going to go there because we definitely want to check it out. Now, I want to jump ahead and start to talk about pathogen versus pesticide, right? We really want to have an idea of what's the difference. So when we're talking about pathogens, what we're talking about is disease-causing microorganisms. So things like bacteria, funguses, viruses, some of those things, right? So they can grow these microorganisms and they can cause disease. Here's the thing that's interesting is that they can actually grow on our food. And then that's where we start to see, like foods that make us ill. Perhaps we get sick from something that we've eaten. And many people who have gone through treatment understand that in certain parts of the treatment, we really have to pay attention to minimizing any cross-contamination or being exposed to foods that may be pathogenic, right? Also, pathogens have the potential to actually kill other organisms. They can also reproduce, right? They themselves. They can reduce reproduction of another organism, or they can shorten the shelf life of a pest. We also see pathogens have an impact on biological pesticides. The other thing that is important for us to understand is that it can be host specific, meaning that what's happening inside one person can be very different than another with regard to how they respond to that pathogen. And it's the same thing also for plants and animals. Now, when we're talking about pesticides, these are substances that are used to kill or repel pests. And sometimes it's a single substance or it's a mixture of substances. And as I said, the idea is to destroy, repel, and mitigate pests. So that's like our insecticides or our fungicides. It's interesting, pesticides can kill pathogens. However, there's a disadvantage when it comes to human immunity and consumption because we don't actually want to have pesticides, that we don't want to ingest pesticides as humans, regardless of if we have a pre-existing condition. And then the other thing is that pesticides actually can have an impact on the survival and growth of foodborne pathogens, right? So we can spray something down. So let's say I had a patient that was traveling in areas where the water was not potable, meaning it wasn't safe to drink, right? And there were pathogens in the water, and they used pesticides to kill the pathogens so that the water would be drinkable. Now, let's think a little bit about the potential health impacts of exposure to pesticides and pathogens for survivors. So in the agricultural industry, direct contact with pesticides is actually completely one of the leading causes of some cancers to our farmers. And there's also a link between direct contact with some pesticides and the development of breast, colon, bladder, skin, and ovarian, as well as prostate cancer. And this is what the research is telling us. So we know that this is the case, particularly for some children, but it's also the case for people who work in agriculture and people who are exposed to these pesticides on a regular and consistent basis. We also know that when there's a higher load, that there's an increased risk. Now, the CPF pesticide, one of the things that we've seen with those is that there's something that's referred to as this redox imbalance. And what it does is it has a shift in the antioxidant defense systems. And so this disruption happens where either there are too many antioxidants, right? So that the antioxidants actually exceed the oxidants, or on the other hand, the oxidants exceed the antioxidants, right? So we have more oxidative stress that's happening within the body. And in both settings, that can actually lead to disease. Pesticides also have this ability to impact hormonal balance. And in some cases, we see these endocrine disrupting chemicals, and they have this negative impact on hormone production, signaling, and metabolism. Sometimes these chemicals, they actually can mimic or block or change hormone function, and that leads to this imbalance that we're talking about. So that's something that we also really want to have an eye on. Studies have also shown that for certain organochlorine pesticides, like fungicides and herbicides, they actually have these toxic qualities that have a negative impact on our DNA, and then they cause an alteration in our cells. So that's one of the other links that we see between some of these pesticide exposures, so the fungicides and the herbicides, and oxidative stress, as well as the way that they impact with hormonal control. Of course, we want to be mindful of environmental exposures. We want to have regular checkups, and we also want to engage in preventative measures. Now, here's the thing. We know that for survivors, that we have an altered metabolic and immune response to pesticides. So we really want to take extra care. So now we have to think about these food-related exposures. And I started out by talking about the different labels, right, of organic, local, regenerative, and natural. And then we're thinking about these pathogens versus pesticides. And we know that for sensitive populations, we want to be very, very mindful. Well, now we've got to think about these food-related pesticide exposures. I want you to just go back and think about that regenerative agriculture, the link between the soil health, the nutrient density of the soil, the plant, or the animal. So here, when we're thinking about these food-related pesticide exposures, I want to start by saying, number one, the EPA, they set tolerances on a crop-by-crop basis because they want to make sure that these exposures do not exceed acceptable levels. So there is this chain of command to make sure that our food system is in fact safe, right? It's challenging because there is a benefit to making sure that our foods are not infested by pests. And what we want to do is strike this balance. So as I said, the Environmental Protection Agency, they really set this standard. And then they work with the Food and Drug Administration to enforce those standards. And then the FDA is meant to actually report any violation to the US Department of Agriculture, where they would then investigate that violation if it was found. And then the USDA and the FDA work together to report their findings. So sometimes we get food recalls, which is critical for every farm. Food source sure that pesticide levels are really within this certain level. When we're thinking about food-related pesticide exposures, very, when we're thinking about meat and poultry, how how do we kind of mitigate this? We know that livestock, they get exposed to pesticides through contaminated feed. So grain, maybe the hay, the grass that was treated with pesticides. Perhaps they actually ingest that pesticide that was present in a water source. And then some pesticides are actually used directly on the animals to control things like parasites, so like flea and tick treatments. From our perspective, we're concerned about bioaccumulation, so the way that pesticides accumulate in the fat tissues of animals over time. And certain pesticides, some of those organochlorines that I spoke about, have actually been found in meat and linked to potential endocrine disruption. It's found mostly in the fatty tissue. And in an upcoming slide, I'll give you an actionable tip about what to do about that. So then we also have grains like our wheat, our rice, corn, oats. Grains can be treated with herbicides and fungicides because the farmers want to prevent mold and pest infestations. So post-harvest, one of the concerns is that perhaps there's pesticides that are being used in storage facilities to prevent insect infestations. The health concern for us is that there's residue that stays on whatever that grain is, the wheat, the rice, the corn, or the oats. And then there's the potential to transfer it to us. Now, with the fish and the seafood, fish can actually, as they move their way up that food chain, so the smaller fish, and then they get eaten by larger fish, that's that bioaccumulation that can happen just from eating the animal protein of the other fish. The other question too is the fish, absorbing pesticides that are contaminated from water sources, rivers, lakes, oceans, that's been actually polluted by agricultural runoff. Farmed fish, there's a question there, and kind of the practices that are used in aquaculture to control parasites and algae. So again, for us, we're concerned about bioaccumulation of those pesticides. And then fruits, remember I talked about, the skins and the waxes that can be used. So things like strawberries, peaches, apples, grapes, sometimes they're treated with insecticides or fungicides or herbicides. And that usually happens post-harvest just to make sure that nothing actually settles onto that thin-skinned fruit. So for the agricultural worker, that is definitely of concern. And then for us, it's how do we navigate this? Vegetables, some of this is quite similar to the fruit. And then we have dairy and eggs. So what do we want to do? Like, how do we minimize this? We want to wash and peel our fruits and vegetables where and when possible. This sounds quite familiar for many of you. This, I'm going to say, and you'll hear me say it again, where and when possible, organic and regenerative foods, especially for some of those things that are thinner skinned. Choose some of those lean cuts of meat to reduce the fat stored, any pesticides that may be saturated in the fatty tissues of the animal. For sure, eat down that food chain. I am a huge believer in diversity in what you're consuming. And I think that variety is key. And then, of course, you want to check seafood advisories. So some other tips that I have are to visit local farmers markets, talk to your farmer, go there, inquire about the pesticide use and production, the pesticides that are used in production. They usually will tell you. When possible, as I said, we definitely want to see USDA certified organic produce. If you come across a regenerative label, that's also great. Now you have a real idea of what goes into those farming practices. Water, fresh water. If you live in an area where you do not have access to clean, fresh water, then you'd need to use bottled water to wash your produce. But in theory, it should be washed for a minimum of 30 seconds under fresh running water. You want to dry your produce with a clean cloth or a paper towel. If that's not the case, then you're going to allow it to air dry. For anything that is like dimpled or like a hard skin, like a melon or a root vegetable, scrub it with a scrub brush to get the dirt out of it. And as I said before, in some cases, you may want to peel whatever that vegetable is before you're consuming it. This is interesting. You might say, like, why should I think about wearing protective clothing like long sleeves, pants, boots, gloves, masks when exposed to pesticide containing toxic chemicals? If you're gardening, my recommendation is if you've got an herb garden or a victory garden or you're homesteading for some reason, that you actually want to think about the type of soil that you're using. You want to think about the additives. And then if you are working with pesticides in your yard or your garden box for some reason, you should absolutely be covering your body. And as I said before, trim fat and skin from meat and poultry to minimize pesticide residue that might accumulate in the fat. Where and when possible, if you consume organ meat, it should absolutely be organic. Organ meats for many of the animals are filters. And if you're having organ meats, which are really nutrient rich, my recommendation is that they should absolutely be organic. And then in terms of seafood, when I'm working with patients, I always recommend that you eat lower down that food chain. For example, if you're thinking about those larger fish, like some of your tunas, those are really gigantic fish. You might want to have what we refer to as smash fish, right? So sardines, mackerel, anchovy, salmon, and herring. Those are smaller fish, and sometimes you can find them tinned, which cuts down on the price. When it's season, you can actually purchase them for a lower cost. But I definitely recommend eating lower down the food chain because we really want to limit that bioaccumulation that I referred to in the past. So those would be my actionable tips. One thing that is not listed here, and I often talk about with my patients, is the inclusion of foods that are accessible, affordable, and culturally relevant. How do you take some of these actionable tips and actually put them into that framework without breaking the bank? This is where I say it's very important to become an informed consumer and learn to read that nutrition facts label. If you do not have access to fresh foods and you need to rely on frozen, canned, boxed, jarred alternatives, they absolutely can fit. In theory, if you're looking for a piece of produce or if you're looking for an animal protein and it is boxed, canned, jarred, or frozen, that nutrition facts label, that ingredient list, you want to see the name of whatever it is that you're looking for. And that first ingredient makes up the majority of what's in that package. So if you're thinking about buying something and the first ingredient is not the thing that you're looking for example, let's say you're looking for artichokes and it says that the first ingredient is sodium or salt, then you know that the majority of that package is actually salt and it's not artichokes. So you want to become an informed consumer and be able to read that nutrition facts panel and that ingredient list so that you're getting the foods that you want. Ideally, if you are doing canned, just so you all know, BPA has been removed from the canned supply. So all cans at this point in 2025 should be BPA free. So if you see that on the label, that's great, but it shouldn't be there anyway. So if you're using canned goods, for sure, read those ingredient lists as well. The same thing with your frozen. in general, when I'm working with survivors, I do suggest foods in the whole and minimally processed form with limited additives. And you'll notice that I'm really talking about whole foods, not the store, but the actual whole foods. And I suggest also that if you have to look at partially prepared foods, that you're using what I refer to as chef's helpers. So things that are maybe chopped, but that they don't have a preservative added to it. So if it's like a baby carrot, it's just baby carrots. There shouldn't be any other ingredients on that list. Because what I encourage my patients to do is to have as many fruits and vegetables that they can tolerate as possible, as a way to help balance their system while limiting their exposure. And so I really err on the side of foods in their whole and minimally processed forms. And so now I would love to open it up to questions here. I think we have just about 15 minutes for questions. So that's a great question. And what I found in the research is that pesticides can actually settle in the fatty tissues of whatever animal protein you're consuming. So as the individual, when you consume it, it goes into your body and your body actually metabolizes it. I don't have a set number of days that it stays in your body. But what we do know with survivors is that treatment actually can change the way that the immune system reacts. And so when we're thinking about those pesticides from foods, I count survivors in that immune compromised population. So that's one of the reasons why I really do suggest that organic or regenerative, simply because the DNA has been altered. And so there is an increased risk. I can't give you the exact percentage, but we do know that the more that you're exposed to it, it's not actually beneficial. So it's interesting. I was telling Katie Grace that I went to a talk last week about the New York State Chemical and Additives Exposure Act that one of our senators in New York City is putting forward. And this may be familiar to some of you all. And in this act, they're really looking to reduce some of the food dyes that are in packaged goods. And so across the board, I would actually say all of those food dyes would be something that I would suggest people stay away from. Some of those like PCBs that I spoke about before, that we see in some farming, I'm always really careful because I don't want to scare people, but we do know that the outcomes are better when we do actually have organic foods. And so what I actually recommend is, for the things that you eat the majority of the time, if possible, I would switch over to making those things organic. So let's say it's a low lift to make all your pastas and your rice organic, because that is more affordable than having organic eggs, then I would absolutely do so. One of the things that I can do is put together like maybe a list of like hierarchy and share it back so it can go into the speaker notes, because I would want to make sure that I give you like a realistic, like if you can't have this, then have this. I pause because we definitely want to rinse our berries to simply get off the dirt. However, depending on how the berry was grown and processed, because it is quite thin skin, it may not actually reduce whatever the pesticide load is on the berry. What I can say is that I visited a number of berry farms, and the largest berry distributor in the US that I visited, They actually use integrated pest management, which is a system where they reduce their pesticide use mainly because it's so expensive, and they're actually using pests to eat other pests. And so, depending on where you're getting your berries from, if it's organic or if it's coming from US sources, to be quite honest, there should be a lower pesticide load. Again, that would be something that I would absolutely recommend: organic, regenerative. Talk to your local farmer to see how they're growing it. But yeah, the farmers market berries can be $12 in the summer. This is where frozen may come in, right? It's picked at the height of the growing season. You can get frozen organic berries for $2.99 at a variety of stores. I love this question so much. I do. You've got to get that soil that's there out, because you're totally right. It is chemical and it is totally polluted. And then you've got to lay something down and have all new fresh soil. That's the only recommendation, is that you've got to start from scratch and that you shouldn't be using the soil that's existing there. So you definitely want to get rid of, depending on how big your plot is, you want to dig down for sure a few feet, get rid of all of that stuff, and then you want to bring in new fresh topsoil. Absolutely. It is shocking in the US, to think that we've got a clean water challenge. There are places in this country where people absolutely do not have access to clean water. In that case, for sure, it needs to be bottled. And then, of course, there are a number of questions about the price of bottled water. And then there are all sorts of types of filters that can be purchased for in-home, countertop, under the counter. But I do say that I recommend for the majority of my patients that they have a high quality filtration system to filter their water. I absolutely do. That's a really great question. So when I was reading through some of this research studies, it does seem that there can be an impact on the endocrine system. So like our hormones that could kind of like prime the pump for later in life. And we absolutely also did see it in the case of environmental toxins. For example, people who were exposed to burn pits, or even in demolition sites where things fell down and burned, like 9/11, for example, many, many years later, people being diagnosed with cancers. It absolutely can have an impact. So I think that that's a great question. And I would say a few things about that. um, One is, it depends on how far out from treatment you are, and how your digestive system is feeling. If you're still in the place where you're experiencing kind of the swing back and forth between loose stool, diarrhea, and constipation, having a sensitive stomach, sushi, because it is in fact raw, could be harder to tolerate. I also would say that if anyone is going to consume sushi, should really be coming from a high quality source. We want to make sure that we're being mindful about the amount of higher food chain fish that we're consuming, because, as I said, we know that there's that kind of increased load the higher up the food chain we go, specifically with regard to some mercury. Um, and so I would want to actually sit and really think about it, because sushi can be beneficial, because seafood has omega-3 fatty acids, fantastic source of protein. Depending on the type of fish, it might even be a source of vitamin D. I mean, it's incredibly nutrient dense. And so I don't want to totally discount it, But I do want to say, A, work with your healthcare provider to come up with a plan if this is something that is near and dear to you. Really be aware of where you are in relation to finishing treatment. Be aware of where you're sourcing your sushi from. And then also be aware of how your actual body reacts to the foods that you consume. I feel like, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I feel like overall, when we're thinking about nutrition, sometimes we make it very complicated. And we think that we have to follow whatever the newest trend is, when in fact, ideally, we're consuming fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, seeds, as much as we can tolerate. If we eat animal proteins, seafood 2 to 3 times per week from lower down the food chain. If we're going to go up the food chain, that we're paying attention to how often we have it. And then for our animal proteins, like our meat, we're definitely having lean sources. And for our poultry, if we're consuming poultry, again, I prefer for survivors to have heritage or organic poultry. Um, and that is kind of how we want to shape our pattern of eating, mostly from organic or regenerative sources, because we're thinking about reducing the pesticide, the toxin load. We're also thinking about food that is more nutrient dense. And I think I talked about that at the beginning. The nutrient density is really what helps our cells to express and have these positive conversations and keeps us in a place where ideally all of our metabolic systems are functioning optimally.